Let's fork a repository now. And for this, I'm back here on the landing page of the account that holds the organization and which also is kind of the owner of our GitHub Basics repository. For the purpose of this course, I'll leave the organization now. I'll not leave it, I'll just switch back to the personal user account. We learned that we can do this over here. So in our dashboard, I'll switch back to my, initial personal user account, this one here. In there, as I said, we have this repository, which we can ignore at the moment. And we have these two repositories, which are part of the organization. These are two private repositories. And we have this GitHub Basics repository. This is a public repository owned and only available basically in this personal user account. If we select this repository now and go to settings over here and there to manage access, we see that this repository has one collaborator. That's my other account, this Manu Lawrence account you all know about in the meanwhile. And as I said, the thing about forking is that for public repositories, which is the case right here, the process I show you right here works the same with the example of a collaborator here, or also if a person not being part of this project would follow this process. I can also prove this to you by opening a new browser window where I'm not logged in. So in here, I am in the GitHub Basics repository. This is the code ribbon. And over there, you see I have this fork option. That's the option I'm referring to. As you can see, I must be signed in to fork a repository, which makes a lot of sense. If you think back about the slide, you saw that forking basically means copying a remote repository to my own account. So if I'm not logged into GitHub, I don't have an account, so this doesn't work. But what I show you here basically works for any public repository. Of course, there might be some restrictions applied to the repositories. We talked about different ways to restrict repository access earlier in this module. But if you just create a public repository, no specific restrictions, this forking process works for anybody, which is also not part of your project. So let's close this window here though, and let's go back to the collaborator account. So in here, I'm back in my Edge browser. That's the collaborator account, this Manu Lawrence account. And in here, I'm already in the GitHub Basics repository. And there I can now fork this repository, by simply clicking onto this button. And as you see, I fork my own copy of this repo to my account. So let's do this. Here I can now assign where this should be forked to. As I said, this account right here is now part of two organizations, part of the Academate organization and of our GitHub course organization we created. I want to fork it to my personal account here though. That's my personal user account and that's the one I want to use here. So let's do this. Now the forking process takes a few seconds and it is done. Now, what can we see in here? Well, not a lot difference to the actual repository, to be honest, but very important. Here on top, we can now see two important, types of information. The first one is that now the account holding that repository is the Manu Lawrence account, no longer the mloam account, so the initial owner of the repository. And we also get the information that this is a forked repository, and we also see where it was forked from. This will become important later when we talk about the pull request, because GitHub is aware of the fact that this is forked and also where it was forked from. Nevertheless, now we have this repository in our account, and if we go back to the account starting page here, you can also see this. Here, as I said, these two repositories are other repositories required for the next course module, so you can ignore these. But you can see that here we have our normal repository being displayed as collaborator. And here with this fork symbol, we see that this is a forked repository, and that's the repository we now want to work on. Therefore, let's select it. And now we can follow our typical process. We can simply go to code over here, then copy the URL like this. Now I'll again create a new folder, open a new VS Code instance, as always, and then clone that into this new project. So please do the same if you want to follow along. So this is my new, VS Code window. I created a fork folder here, and then I will just run git clone once again, paste the URL, again, space dot. We learned about this already throughout the course. With this, the cloning process should be successful. And now we can quickly check our branches in here. I think we only have the main branch, or the master branch as we call it here. So when doing this forking process, you can now either create a new branch, for example, implement the features there, and then push this new branch to your repository. For the purpose of this course, I'll remain in the master branch here though, and simply add a new commit there, and then show you how you can bring this commit to the initial remote repository. With that, we can actually clear this, and I'll now create a new folder and maybe call it forked, like that. Here, I'll open this folder and add a new text file, maybe added feature.text, and then we could say new feature added, new feature added. Of course, this doesn't have any kind of code relation here in this context, but in the next module, we'll also explore this feature here at the example of a real web dev project. As always throughout this course, this is all about understanding how Git works and why it works in a certain way. So as I said, if you're looking for a more practical application of this, you will find it in a lot of detail in the next course module. Nevertheless, we added this new feature. Okay, close this here. And now we'll also add this to the staging area and create a new commit and said added new feature, like this. And now we run git clone, so local tracking branch. This means we can simply run git push, and this change, this new commit, will be pushed to the remote repository in my personal user account, so it will not affect the other repository in the, initial account that created and holds it. With that, the push process was successful. Let's now go back to our account here. Here we are. Let's now reload it. And as you see, the forked folder was added, so this was successful. And if we now check out the other account, so the actual holder of the original repository, in here, this is the account. So if we go to GitHub Basics here, you see that we don't have this latest commit. So that's very important to understand. These two remote repositories are not related at all. The question now though is, we have this forked repository, we added this commit to the repository in our account, but how can we now, merge these changes into this repository, into the master branch of this repository? That's our next step.